Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, laid out fundamental freedoms and protections for American citizens. However, the right to vote, a cornerstone of democracy, was not initially granted to all. Over the course of nearly 2 centuries, a series of constitutional amendments and landmark legislation gradually extended voting rights to more Americans, though the struggle for truly equal suffrage continues today. In the early years of the United States, voting was a privilege restricted to an elite group. Many states allowed only white male adult property owners to cast ballots. This effectively disenfranchised women, racial minorities, and the poor white population. The ratification of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1870 marked an important milestone. It prohibited the denial of voting rights based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment, in theory, granted African American men the right to vote by nullifying discriminatory provisions adopted in the pre- and post-Civil War eras. However, the 15th Amendment's promised suffrage did not immediately translate into practice. From the 1870s through the 1960s, various discriminatory laws, processes, and violence at the hands of vigilantes and groups like the Ku Klux Klan effectively prevented millions of Black Americans from exercising their voting rights, particularly in southern states. Literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and other means were employed to subvert the amendment's intent. Literacy tests. Implemented after the 15th Amendment, literacy tests required voters to prove they could read and interpret passages of text before being allowed to cast a ballot. The tests were often administered in a discriminatory way, with difficult passages chosen to trick or fail Black voters specifically. Barriers like this made it extraordinarily difficult for formerly enslaved people to exercise their new rights. Grandfather clauses. These laws allowed illiterate white people to vote if their ancestors had been able to vote before the 15th Amendment was ratified. This explicitly excluded most Blacks whose ancestors were enslaved. Grandfather clauses created a generational injustice by denying suffrage to those descended from disenfranchised families and communities. It took decades of further activism, including the women's suffrage movement, to expand voting rights more broadly. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, prohibits the denial of voting rights on the basis of sex. This finally allowed women to vote in federal elections and was a monumental victory after generations of struggle by pioneering leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Ida B. Wells, and others. Many of these leaders realized that true universal suffrage required both gender equality and racial equality at the ballot box. As Ida B. Wells said, "There is not a single right that women ever obtained but what was inextricably linked up with the rights of the colored people." However, the racist policies and violence of the Jim Crow era continued suppressing Black women from voting even after the 19th Amendment was passed. One of the most insidious obstacles to voting rights was the use of poll taxes by states. A poll tax required eligible voters to pay a tax or fee before being allowed to cast a ballot. 7 states continued to employ poll taxes as a way to deter poor Americans, including impoverished Blacks, from voting even after the 19th Amendment was passed. On the surface, these taxes were small fixed fees. However, for many impoverished Americans unable to overcome this financial hurdle, they amounted to an unconstitutional denial of voting rights. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, abolished poll taxes in federal elections, declaring the right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president or vice president, for electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representative in Congress shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. While the 24th Amendment was limited to federal elections, the Supreme Court's 1966 ruling in Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections prohibited the use of poll taxes in all state elections as well. This finally put an end to this particularly unjust mechanism of voter suppression that disproportionately kept poor and minority Americans from fully participating in democracy for nearly a century after the 15th Amendment's ratification. Despite these constitutional amendments, the struggle was far from over. It took decades more of mass action and protest, including the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, to help fully realize the promise of equal voting rights. Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery marches. One of the most iconic events of the civil rights movement were the Selma to Montgomery marches of 1965. On Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, nearly 600 peaceful voting rights marchers were violently attacked by state and local police with billy clubs, tear gas, and whips as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The images of this brutality helped galvanize national support for the movement. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Spurred by events like Bloody Sunday, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a landmark piece of federal legislation that enforced and expanded the 15th Amendment's prohibitions against racial discrimination in voting nationwide. It outlawed discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests and provided federal oversight of elections in states and localities with a history of voter suppression. The act is considered one of the most transformative civil rights laws in American history. However, efforts to protect the right to vote have persisted into recent years. In the 2013 Supreme Court decision Shelby County v. Holder, the court effectively struck down the formula used to determine which states were subject to federal oversight and pre-clearance of voting law changes under the Voting Rights Act. In the years since, many states have passed voter identification laws and other measures that voting rights advocates argue disproportionately burden minority, poor, elderly, and disabled voters. Some of these laws require specific types of photo ID, place restrictions on early voting periods and mail-in ballots, lead to polling place closures in certain areas, and more. There have also been controversies over allegations of voter suppression tactics like aggressive voter roll purges. As such, the decades-long push to realize the full promise of the 15th Amendment continues into the present day. In 2021, the House of Representatives passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to restore and update elements of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, though the bill later stalled in the Senate amid partisan gridlock. Voting rights and equal access to the ballot box remain actively contested issues as the United States continues working to uphold its core democratic principles. From the abolition of race-based voter discrimination to women's suffrage to prohibiting poll taxes and literacy tests, the Bill of Rights has been extended and amended significantly with regards to voting rights over the past 150 years. However, this history illustrates that achieving universal and equitable suffrage has been an ongoing battle involving constitutional amendments, legislation, court rulings, and grassroots activism at nearly every step. While monumental strides have been made since the early days of the Republic, when only a small portion of the population could vote, recent years have seen a renewed focus on protecting voting rights and ensuring all eligible citizens can participate freely and fairly in elections. Barriers like voter ID requirements, polling place closures, and restrictions on mail-in and early voting have become new fronts in the battle over access to the ballot. The long arc of American history shows that upholding and expanding democracy is a constant struggle, one that is fundamental to the nation's identity and the civic rights enshrined in its founding documents. From the revolutionaries who protested no taxation without representation to the heroes of the civil rights movement, the right of all citizens to vote and have an equal voice has been hard fought and never permanently guaranteed. Maintaining that right requires vigilance and continued effort from each succeeding generation.